morning, good afternoon. I'm so happy today that we are going to have a discussion that will center us in terms of what's happening in our world of national security. I want to introduce our speakers today, one of whom people who have been coming to the center for the last 14 years have known for the last 14 years, Steve Simon. He's now a visiting lecturer at Dartmouth College. Before that, he's been a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been the executive director at the Institute for International and Strategic Studies, which is based in London. He's written profusely about national security, the Middle East, American foreign policy, and terrorism. Mostly, Steve is known by experts in the field for being author of the book, The Age of Sacred Terror, Radical Islam's War Against America, which is by far the seminal book on the roots of bin Ladenism and Al-Qaeda-ish terrorism. And I suggest that if you want to understand the age we've been living in since 9/11, you could do no better than to start with that book, which he co-authored with Dan Benjamin, with whom he still does a variety of collaborative projects, one of which was an op-ed piece, which you should probably read, that was in the New York Times earlier this week, and which we're going to talk about a little bit today on why the United States is not France, or something along those lines. His co-author on the Pax Americana piece is also with us today, Jonathan Stevenson, a professor of strategic studies at the U.S. Naval War College, and somebody I'm supposed to have known for a long time, but somehow terrorism brought us together. But we have had many ties going back to my childhood and his childhood. We needed this focus and concentration. Maybe there's something about growing up in southeastern Connecticut that makes you care about national security, like nuclear submarines, things like that. Yeah, maybe. Jonathan, in addition to teaching at the Naval War College now, like Steve, worked at the White House on Middle Eastern affairs and North African affairs. He has written voluminously also about terrorism, about American strategic interest in the world. The book I would direct you to of his is called Thinking Beyond the Unthinkable. He's also written about the IRA and a number of other issues that are outside the kind of terrorism that we've focused on here for the past 10 plus years. I think today's discussion is going to be illuminating to all of us and maybe even to our panelists as we move along. But I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions, and I'm going to start with Jonathan and ask you why you wanted to write this piece, the Pax Americana piece.
I think to some extent we wanted to.
You have to speak into the.
Can you hear me now? Well, I think we were looking at the fact that the Obama administration, where both of us worked, was facing a lot of criticism for what was perceived as a timid approach to foreign policy and security in the Middle East, and was sometimes characterized as something close to a withdrawal. We choose to refer to it as a pullback, and I think we wanted to, in the first instance, defend his basic approach to the Middle East, and I think secondly to frame it in terms that make it clearer what the strategy going forward would be and why the way the administration has dealt with the region isn't merely a reaction, nor is it merely a matter of convenience, but in fact fits into a larger strategic pattern, and one that's informed by the fact that the U.S. has lost some traction in the Middle East for a variety of reasons, most of which have to do with what's going on there and not what's going on in Washington.
Steve, you've been in and out of Washington discussions for a long time now. And one of the points that's made that Jonathan just referred to is that this shouldn't be seen as a withdrawal, that Obama's policy is mischaracterized as a withdrawal. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Sure, Karen. There are a number of factors, I think, that fueled this perception of Obama's policy. One is that earlier in the administration, the senior officials talked about a pivot to Asia, what we call the pivot surprise, because it was a bit of a surprise to people who were working on the Middle East. But that immediately generated a lot of controversy, particularly in Europe, where NATO allies, looked at each other and looked at the U.S. and said, "What? We're chopped liver?" And in the Middle East, the reaction was one that it went beyond disappointment. It led to profound vexation, actually, because they felt abandoned. So the administration changed its language. I mean, there was just a perception if there's a pivot, you're turning your back on something while you turn your face toward the other thing. So there was a sense that the U.S., having made this pivot, would no longer attend to its interests or the interests of its allies in the Middle East. So the administration changed its language to rebalance it. But that really didn't do very much good. I don't think our allies found it all that reassuring. The administration didn't mean it to be as troubling to its allies as it turned out to be. I don't think that there was ever any intention to withdraw in that profound sense, in a comprehensive sense. And in fact, in military terms, it didn't really, the pivot or rebalancing didn't really mean very much. But it led to this. It led to the sensation of, or a sense rather, of abandonment on the part of our allies. And then one other thing happened that was, several things happened that intensified the fears and anxieties that had been generated earlier in the administration within the region. And one of those big things was the outreach to Iran by the United States, which greatly frightened Arab allies and troubled Israelis as well. And here, I think we see a bit of what I guess we'll talk about maybe throughout this discussion, and that's the differences that have emerged during this administration, the strategic differences that have emerged during this administration between the U.S. and its traditional allies.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that, the realignment of our alliances?
Sure. Look, I wouldn't go really so far as to say there's been a realignment, because I don't think a realignment is really possible. Despite these tensions and the differences that have arisen between the U.S. and its allies, they're still sort of wrapped around each other's axle. These relationships might be dysfunctional or even descend into the realm of hostile dependency on big issues, but they can't be abandoned, if only for hedging purposes on the part of both sides in these relationships, and in part because neither side really has anywhere else to go, even though Arabs and Israelis fear that the U.S. has found another place to go, and that is Iran. These allies, they do talk about having options. The Israelis, talk about new relationships that they've developed both with some European countries on the southern flank, Eastern Europe, China, India, and so forth. But they're not, a strategic replacement, substitute in any way for the United States, and many Israelis, I think, understand that. And the Arabs, especially in the Gulf, talk about alternatives as well, but none of these claims is plausible. So, we're kind of stuck with each other. But the differences are now profound, and it's not just over Iran. There are issues that trouble our Arab allies that simply, don't really implicate U.S. interests, whether it's the intra-Sunni split between Wahhabis and the Muslim Brothers, or it's the Sunni-Shia split. We're not. The United States is not going to get involved in a sectarian war, but the wars, the civil wars in the Middle East have taken on a decidedly sectarian, character. We're not going to implicate ourselves in that, but our allies want us to. So this has all devolved, and I'll just end on this point. This has all devolved, to a debate about American leadership, which has struck me as, really. The term strikes me at this point as really more of an epithet than anything else. In other words, there's dissatisfaction with the United States because we seem not to be supporting policies that people think we ought to support. But, what it really means in this debate is the United States leadership is the United States doing things that undermine its own interests to make its allies happy. It's a bit of a perverse, definition of leadership, and in that sense, it's really used as an epithet by unhappy allies who have no alternatives, and that, of course, just intensifies their unhappiness.
Jonathan, one of the things you referred to in the article briefly is oil, and the changing nature of our reliance on oil, the changing production of oil, et cetera. Can you just expand a little bit upon what the role of oil is in this shifting?
Yeah, we say that fracking and the consequent increase in relative American energy independence basically gives us more discretion in how we execute or formulate and implement policy in the Middle East, and that it just gives us a little bit more running room. But at the same time, we also, I think, take pains to note, this is in line with what Steve said about hedging and about the need to recognize that certain kinds of partnerships and alliances are wrapped around our axle. We take care to say that we still have to safeguard, for example, a relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, because it's not known, it's certainly unclear how long this energy boom will last, and it's also clear that regardless of our energy independence, Saudi Arabia, in particular, can still influence the global price of oil with its behavior, and therefore, in terms of our obligations as an actor, a major actor in international economics, we have to safeguard that relationship.
Can you talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia plays into what's going on now, and does or doesn't play into what's going on in Syria right now in the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, Steve talked about, Saudi Arabia has asked or pressured the United States to be more involved in the fight. And from the Saudi standpoint, this is a proxy war. It involves Sunnis, their Sunni clients, which in some ways include elements of ISIS, or have done, insofar as they've infiltrated the Syrian opposition, against Iran's proxy, which is the Assad regime. And it would be awkward, to say the least, for us to get integrally involved, say with some kind of ground deployment, in what is at its core a sectarian war, and very difficult for us to extricate ourselves from it once we were there. It seems to me we learned this lesson with arguably an even simpler scenario, and a less complicated one in Iraq.
One of the things that President Obama said in his remarks that were delivered in Turkey on Monday, talking about France and in general the conflict with ISIS, was on this question of American involvement, that we learn lessons from the past, and that unless local forces are at the forefront of this fight against ISIS, once the United States and or other coalition forces withdraw, you end up back where you started. That was the gist of his remarks. Do you think that there is a tipping point in that calculation where at some point there's a lot of push for Americans to, go back in with strength, particularly from some of the presidential candidates, which we'll get to in a minute. Do you think there's a tipping point and something that could change the calculation about America taking the supportive role rather than a leading role?
You mean to tip us back into
Yeah.
a leading role?
Yes. Other than a new election and a new president.
Honestly, only to the extent that our not getting involved in a more wholesale way would somehow impair our homeland security, really. If there were some nexus between our getting involved and staving off, a chain of attacks on the U.S. homeland, perhaps. But it doesn't seem to me that there's anything like that kind of clear nexus involved.
And calls from the rest of the world to take a leading role couldn't take
Well,
that either?
calls to just do something out of indignation or anger are still, it doesn't make any sense to go in if ultimately our effort's going to be unavailing. So no. So the answer remains no. I think the president is correct in saying that the current policy is staying out of Syria militarily for the most part, except the air campaign is correct.
Steve, do you agree with that? That the tipping point would have to be some kind of attack directly on the United States?
I think it would have to be a very serious attack, and it would have to be directly and more or less definitively attributable to ISIS for the U.S. to put more troops in. I mean, beyond the 50 special forces that are now co-located with Kurdish forces in northern Syria.
I want to talk a little bit about the framework in which we understand this conflict. A number of candidates and pundits have referred to this week as a clash of civilizations. Is this a clash of civilizations, Steve?
Well, in the sense that Republicans and Democrats, worlds, I think, that's an accurate statement.
How about beyond that?
So you don't want to look at the big picture. No, I don't. I think it's a clash of civilizations in a very narrow way. I mean, in the sense that ISIS represents a set of, civilizational or cultural values, if you want to put it that way, that are deeply alien to the United States, the West in general, and it's probably disgusting and repulsive to populations on other planets. I mean, it's pretty bad, and they've made themselves some very serious enemies in the process. But that's a very different thing to what Sam Huntington described in his book and his famous foreign affairs article on bloody borders. I think it's a different phenomenon. Now, where it gets interesting, where the argument gets more interesting, is if you look at Europe. I think where there are problems, there have been problems on both sides in integrating Europe's very sizable Muslim population. And, to some extent, it's a Kulturkampf. These are cultures that don't cohabit terribly comfortably for a lot of reasons, which I guess we could discuss if you want to take the discussion in that way. But that's still different to the global clash of civilizations that Huntington talked about. I also think that, although it's difficult to envisage, actually, at this point, the clash between the one culture and this bigger culture that we're talking about is remediable over time. And my sense from Huntington's article was that actually the clash that he described, he perceived to be an eternal one or immutable.
I think that's right. John, do you want to talk about France, as long as we're looking at Europe, and talk about the timing here in terms of, if it is a cultural clash as opposed to a clash of civilizations, what's the trajectory of immigrant Muslims in France? And where was it headed prior to this attack?
Well, I think France's history, Steve talked about the difficulty that European countries have had in integrating more, by percentages, far more sizable Muslim populations than the one that's here in the United States. I mean, France, around the time of 9/11, France was criticized, I think justifiably, for having a kind of an asymmetrical quid pro quo, whereby they insisted on that their Muslims and other immigrant groups be fully assimilated as French people, but really, at least in effect, were not willing to really regard them as full-fledged Frenchmen. I think that I think they've taken those criticisms on board and tried to change things and make their policies more accommodating, notwithstanding certain headline issues.
Successfully?
Well, I mean, that's the question. I mean, there's still long-standing terrorist infrastructure in France, which probably couldn't have been, completely eradicated, regardless of how accommodating their policies were. And of course, ISIS creates, global headlines that tend to, I think, exacerbate and intensify anti-France feelings that might have been extant already among France's Muslim population. And of course, the fact that France has been actively engaged in the efforts against ISIS in Iraq and Syria would also be a contributing factor. I think that I don't see. We encourage European allies, particularly those in NATO, such as France and the UK, to join us in our efforts to suppress terrorism to the limited extent that we've taken it on in the Middle East, and that's something I think we want to continue to encourage, because it really increases global support overall to have alliance backing. At the same time, so I think there's going to be this tension for the foreseeable future. I guess what I'm saying is that even proactive foreign policies, such as France's in the Middle East, and you could also cite the fact that it's gone out of area into Mali to combat jihadists. Those have to be balanced with not only sound homeland security policies from a nuts and bolts, or locks in the doors point of view, but also enlightened ones pertaining to assimilation and outreach to the Muslim community. It's not a magic bullet, but it's just a logical balance.
Steve, I want to talk a little bit about Al-Qaeda. Remember them? Al-Qaeda? Yeah. It's almost like where does Al-Qaeda fit into this? How do you distinguish between, or not distinguish between, from a counterterrorism point of view, the threat of Al-Qaeda versus the threat of ISIS? Is it safe to say we need a new policy? Is it safe to say we should follow the same kind of policy? And I don't just mean in terms of the issue of boots on the ground, or, versus diplomacy versus military engagement, but really the larger law enforcement counterterrorism effort. Same, different, what?
I'm a business as usual kind of guy, I think, on this. Since it's very difficult to know where the threat is coming from, the axis or vector of these threats, we need very much to focus on defenses, as indeed we have. Not counting our defense spending or spending by the FBI. Defense spending, by the way, includes NSA. That is, the agency in the United States government that collects, communications, signals intelligence and other things. We probably spent, I don't know, $1 trillion since 9/11 on strengthening our defenses. And a lot of that money has gone into protecting the borders, keeping people out. And there's a strong willingness that remains after 9/11 to accept a fairly large beta risk, which is to say, reject when you should accept. we're just very concerned about that. It's hard to get into this country now.
Anyway.
So we've emphasized defenses. This seems to me to be very sensible. I imagine that we're going to do more of that, and I imagine that the downing of the Russian airliner is going to, give another boost to both spending on aviation security, but also the pressure we'll put on other countries to exercise greater care at ports of embarkation in places overseas. So there's that, and the law enforcement and intelligence activities that we presently conduct will probably also be intensified to some degree, but there'll be a lot more pressure, I think, on the Europeans to up their game. I mean, we'll be as supportive as possible, as we have been, perhaps more episodically than would have been desirable. I recall in the Charlie Hebdo case, the United States had information about one of the perpetrators that it failed to share with French law enforcement, or whoever the exact counterpart would have been, in that incident. So clearly, there are lapses, but the Europeans spend, relatively little on what we spend a whole lot. The problem for the Europeans is extremely vexing, in part because of the migrant flow from the Middle East right now. I wouldn't go so far as to say the problem looks unmanageable, because it has to be managed. It has to be managed, and I suspect they'll find a way to manage it that will, combine a degree of exclusion with a degree of, additional vigilance and surveillance and monitoring of people who are coming in and so forth. But this is going to cost a lot of money. The French are already talking about spending more money. They're going to have to do more than talk about it. They're going to have to start appropriating money and building a new system and expanding their system right now. But there's inevitably a lag. There's a lead time to improving these kinds of capabilities, and bad things could happen in that interval. So I think, between those things and the fact that we are conducting military operations still in South Asia and, of course, in Iraq and Syria, and those are operations, I would just add before I shut up, basically. These are operations that are intelligence-driven. The targeting is not all opportunistic or dynamic, and the collection of intelligence and the grip on what it means is an alluvial process. It takes a long time. It'll take a couple of years. In that span of time in South Asia, the United States, the accuracy of its targeted killing program increased quite dramatically. And I expect the same thing, will be true in Syria.
Jonathan, Steve talks about increased surveillance, increased intelligence powers that the French are asking for. At the end of this month, the Patriot Act's surveillance program is what has become its most well-known surveillance program. The metadata program will sunset. Do you foresee any attempts, given the speeches of John Brennan and others in the past few days, that this will try to alter the balance of security and liberty that was somewhat rebalanced over the course of the last 6 months?
Some candidates might try to do that. I'm not sure that all will. There would have to be a demonstrated link between, for example, the collection of metadata, or the inability to collect and process metadata, and greater vulnerability. And I haven't heard anybody mention or make that connection. So I think there's still going to be a fair bit of momentum behind the sunsetting. But
Good. I'm glad to
I
hear that.
kind of hope.
I mean, it's only a couple of days.
Yeah.
But, and I mean, I think you're right. I think there's been every single investigation from inside the government has shown it to be not fruitful.
Right.
That doesn't mean that something could happen. I just wondered if you'd heard any buzz
No,
about
I
that.
haven't, but, you know,
All right. Russia. You guys haven't really talked about Russia. Where does Russia fit into this larger conversation? That would be you.
You know, it's funny, I was in Moscow a couple months ago and met with one of my old adversaries, Mikhail Bogdanov, who was now a deputy foreign minister, but he was their chief Middle East guy, so we kind of bumped into one another in awkward ways for a few years. It was much better seeing him as a private citizen, I have to say. We actually had a civil conversation. And, you know, he said something interesting at that point, which was, well, you know, if Assad goes, the capital of Syria moves instantaneously from Damascus to Raqqa, which is the city where ISIS has its HQ. And it was a striking comment, and he was signaling that the Russians were going to intervene because this came after a series of setbacks that the regime forces had encountered. They lost a town called Jisr Shagur in the northern Syria in a province called Idlib, and they lost Palmyra with devastating results for the people of that city, as well as the ancient Nabatean ruins located there. Anyway, so things were looking kind of bad, and the thing is that, you know, if you think of the map, ISIS and opposition control of Jisr Shagur gave it a commanding view of this kind of valley called Arab, and if they traverse that valley, then they'd have a shot at Latakia, and that was kind of a chilling moment, I would have thought, you know, for the regime and its allies, and it's not surprising that it triggered a Russian decision that had probably been brewing for a while to jump in and buttress the regime, buttress regime forces a bit, and push the Islamists back somewhat. So, you know, a new lease on life for the regime fundamentally changed the nature of the war, it seems to me, as it has also, you know, fundamentally changed the diplomatic picture. The Russian maneuver, I think, instantaneously made plans for safe havens or no-fly zones a much more complicated proposition than they would have been otherwise, and created a new diplomatic framework which put an end to the Geneva process that, if you have followed this, you know, you'll be aware of. There were two big meetings in Geneva that didn't work out, you know, all that well as attempts to negotiate some kind of transitional arrangement for Syria. And the process has now devolved to this Vienna negotiating sequence of meetings, another one of which is coming up quite soon, and that's led to some optimism on the part of the United States and the part of Russia. I think this administration, perforce, has you know, moved closer to the Russian position, despite the American insistence that, you know, the root of the problem is Assad, and if Assad goes, then somehow it becomes much easier to defeat ISIS. That's a strongly held view. The Russian view all along had been precisely the opposite. That, you know, the minute Assad goes, that's when you wind up with a real problem. Now, for the Russians, this is a serious issue, in part because there are a lot of fighters from the former Soviet Union, the states of the former Soviet Union in Syria, and there's a fear that they'll return. There's also an extensive jihadist network, you know, within Russia proper. So they've got a counterterrorism interest in this, which is in some ways, commensurate with, the U.S. interest on that score. But also, I think it's forgotten, or it's not as well remembered as it should be, that the Russians, in the form of the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, have had a very close relationship with Syria for well over half a century. And when the Russians drew down in 2012 because things had gotten very violent and they worried about their people, they pulled out a huge number of people. And the reason the number was so huge was because the extent of intermarriage in Russians with Syrian families was quite significant. And of course, the Russians have strategic installations there that presumably they'd want to protect, especially in the context of Putin's more aggressive or assertive foreign policy. So, they've got a better position in the Eastern Mediterranean, presumably, if they keep their intelligence collection and port and bunkering facilities, on the Syrian coast.
Just to add something, put a gloss on what Steve just eloquently said. I mean, and from the perspective of people who had a lot of visibility on Russia's behavior towards Syria over the past few years, given its equities and in Syria and its beliefs about them, from that perspective, it's actually a little bit surprising it didn't act to forcefully intervene sooner.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about what's actually going on with ISIS. The Obama administration in the past couple of days, and Obama himself, has basically said the reason the French attack happened in part was that ISIS is losing in the Middle East and wanted to make a mark elsewhere, sort of go to a tactic that they thought they could do. But I think the real question is, and the news reports are that ISIS is being pushed back in the cities that Steve talked about and elsewhere, some of the cities he talked about. Are they being pushed back? Is that the general sense of things, or is it a loggerhead? What's the inside story here?
Steve may have more to say on this, but from a sort of a simple post hoc ergo propter hoc point of view, it's a tempting argument to make that the Kurds made some gains against ISIS, and then we were hitting their oil infrastructure pretty hard, and that then this attack happens. And so I think that's a it's a colorable argument. On the other hand, those are essentially marginal gains. And it seems to me that this obviously that there had to be plans in place for this, before the Kurds had made their gains, before we started hitting the oil. Well, I guess we sort of ramped up on the oil infrastructure in October, or a little bit before. So, but the plans were obviously in place for a while. So I think that it's equally sensible to say that ISIS is really simply employing a more extroverted strategy, possibly with the idea, because it wants to divert attention from it may be that it wants to divert attention from losses in the Middle East, but it may also be that they just want to expand the battlefield and to try to, possibly enlist people from farther afield, to get more foreign fighters, to reinforce their positions, I think the other angle is to create the world chaos on which theoretically their jihad will flourish.
The United States, both administrations, made the point that a sign of success was that we took the war there. We took the war off of our shores and put it back in the Middle East. It would seem to me that ISIS is making the counter statement at this point, which is that the war just isn't going to be here in the Middle East. Do you think that's a valid way of viewing part of what's going on?
Yeah, although for it to maintain the integrity of that argument, it has to keep doing it, which is of course a daunting possibility. The other thing I suppose I would add is that you can interpret this kind of attack, the one in Paris, as a sort of the shoe that didn't drop with Al-Qaeda, or at least not in a big way. I mean, I think there was a perception that Al-Qaeda had set the bar very high with 9/11, and was sort of biding its time to make big spectacular attacks, and then occasionally would do the opportunistic one like Bali, Madrid, etc. But I think the big fear was, why would they not try to wreak havoc with simply sort of, IRA-style tactics on steroids more frequently than they did? And it seems to me kind of an urban warfare approach. And I think the worry could be that ISIS now might be trying to implement that. It looked as though Al Qaeda was going to do it a few years ago, but then I think perhaps to take down Bin Laden and the subsequent disarray forced it to decentralize and go regional.
Interesting. Steve, Commissioner Bratton said the other day on the Sunday programs that this was a game changer, that France was a game changer. Would you agree with that or disagree with that?
Well, everything's a game changer. There was a massive attack in Madrid that killed 190 people, not long ago. There were bus and tube attacks in the UK that were, really quite disturbing, carried out by pretty good analogs for the people who carried out the attacks in Paris. There have been disrupted plots going back to the 90s that have been would have been quite serious if they'd have actually eventuated. So, everything's a game changer, everything's a wake-up call, everything's, somebody's 9/11. God knows, after 1941, how many things were, somebody's Pearl Harbor. So I'm not actually inclined to think in those terms. I think, the attack in Paris could have taken place a couple of years ago, could have taken place a couple of years from now. The ingredients were just all there. A very large supply of people willing to massacre compatriots, the weapons, the munitions, the ideology regulating, motivation, to do these kinds of things. So I'm not quite as blown away as Commissioner Bratton, and I think New York has long prepared for precisely this kind of attack. Maybe the commissioner will up New York's game in some ways, and there's certainly there's inevitably room for improvement. And these kinds of attacks do spur upgrades in defensive measures and also in intelligence and surveillance. But I think the sense in which it's a game changer, and I know that you want to go in this direction, so I will. I suspect you want to go in this direction, so I feel free to say this. I think it's a game changer in terms of the issues that will be rooted in the presidential election campaign.
I stand guilty of that direction. So I guess my next question, and this is my last question, and then I'll open it up for your questions, is France a game changer for the rhetoric and the positioning of candidates now for the presidency? Sorry,
I suppose in that limited context, yeah, it's a game changer because it will be it'll be a talking point, particularly among conservatives who don't think much of Obama's foreign policy. And they might say that had we gone into Syria harder, for example, then we could have done more to bog down ISIS and distract its attention from out-of-area attacks. The counter-argument is so easy, it's almost not worth saying.
Go ahead,
Which is essentially, yeah, well, if we'd done that and weakened them there, it would have been all the more reason to undertake operationally less challenging terrorist attacks than battle sustainment in loosely defended Western Syria. So Yeah, I mean, I think it's sure, it'll be a talking point, but I think one which those who are more sympathetic with the president's foreign policy will be able to counter clearly.
Your questions? Yes. Identify yourself and make it a question. Thank you.
Abdurrahim Fakar, I'm the regional director for the Americas for
I'll repeat what you say. Go ahead.
Abdurrahim Fakar, I'm the regional director for the Americas for Al Jazeera Television. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And on the issue of the Middle East and Pax Americana, I just wanted to ask you if you could breathe some new life into the debate about whether the U.S. is just another empire, basically suffering the merciless impatience of history. Obama cannot wait, and if he had a Republican in the White House, he would have done exactly what Obama has done, because the Middle East is so fluid and will continue to be fluid for the next 20, 30 years, God knows how long. Or if you think that the United States is an exceptional empire, and the pullback, as you call it, will enable it eventually 20, 30 years to catch up again in the Middle East.
Steve. I am going to repeat the question. But Steve's good. Can you repeat it? You want me to?
Do you want to make a list?
Yeah. So the question was, is the situation in the Middle East, which is now currently so fluid, one such that if there were a different president, a Republican president in the office now, in essence, he would actually do what President Obama is doing because of the reality on the ground? Or, on the other hand, would is the American sense of exceptionalism one that would dictate a different course?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
It's better if I had.
Okay, so just briefly, there are at this point structural constraints on what the U.S. can do and what it can't do. What we argue in this piece, what John and I argued, was that the opportunities for effectual action were quite limited at this stage, and the administration's reticence, in a sense, was a function of the lack of opportunity to exercise influence or really to change events. And that's what John meant when he said in his introduction, that the issue was more within the region than within the United States. Now, not that there aren't issues within the United States. I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, our campaigns there, the long campaigns there, cost on the order of $4 trillion, or actually will have cost about $4 trillion by the time the U.S. has paid for them. Because remember, all that money was borrowed. So that number could be more or less depending upon interest rates in the out years. But because this is going to affect the way in which military spending is allocated, because of the profound long-term effects on health care for soldiers and retirement payments that will extend as long as this generation of soldiers is around to collect those benefits. The cost is going to be quite steep, and that's going to affect the military's ability to modernize, even as it needs to maintain very high readiness levels, because obviously we're still engaged in combat operations. So, in the global context in which decisions are made, these are important factors, especially as China's policies begin to look more aggressive, or at least assertive, and the Chinese pattern of investment in their military becomes, all the more impressive. I mean, the Chinese are spending like there's no tomorrow, and they're allocating their money to technologies and capabilities that are designed specifically to impede U.S. maritime operations in the Western Pacific. And so the United States needs to do a lot of investment, in that domain. So you've got this global picture, and you've got this budgetary situation that have sort of bumped up against political dynamics internal to the Middle East that have made gains from intervention really rather low. I mean, vanishingly low at this stage. So you get this pullback, which is what we discuss in the article. Now, whether this is an internal situation or not is hard to say at this point. I mean, typically, the U.S. goes through these periods of retraction and then reassertion. So, after Vietnam, we were through with the world. We had wounds to heal at home. We looked pretty bad, having been defeated by a guerrilla army, or that's how it was perceived, although it wasn't really how it worked in Vietnam. But, 5 years later, in the Reagan administration, the U.S. was roaring back, planning to deploy Star Wars and investing hugely in the military and so forth. And that pattern has held true certainly since then. So it's quite possible that, in the next administration, as we've come farther out of the 2008 financial crisis, the Iraq and Afghan wars are increasingly behind us, and there's greater self-confidence here at home, and there might be a renewed involvement. And I think going back to the campaign, I mean, what we're going to see are candidates asserting that the U.S. should be more active in the region. Some of them, as John has said, will argue that the administration's reticence over the past few years has in fact contributed to the problems that the United States is looking at in the Middle East today. I don't believe that to be true, but that will be a claim. And just to close on this sort of long intervention. Administrations in their first year in office are generally constrained or trapped by the positions that they've taken in the campaign. So if you get this more assertive take in the campaign now, I think you can probably expect it to shape what U.S. policy is going to be in that first year.
Why, Turkey has a big army. Why has Turkey been so reluctant to get in and fight ISIS?
Why has Turkey been so reluctant to get in and fight ISIS?
I think for a couple of reasons. One is that Turkish public opinion is against it. They just don't want to see their army, engaged in Syria. Secondly, the Turkish army has been weakened in some ways by a wave of prosecutions on the part of the government against the senior levels in the army. And I think there's a concern within the command of the army that if it did go into Syria to fight, they might not look so good, actually. So, they don't want to do that. And I think, the government in Turkey has been trying to balance, conflicting objectives, like almost every other government that's been, impelled in the direction of this conflict, in the direction of this civil war. On the one hand, they kind of favor ISIS because they hate Assad, and the ISIS people are fervent Muslims. On the other hand, they see the potential for destabilization of Turkey. And they look at how the Kurds have insinuated themselves into this fight in a way to attract Western and particularly Allied, support. And that's a troubling thing for Turkey, which has long worried about the Kurdish instinct for separatism. So, it's a complicated thing, and I'm not surprised that they, like most other countries, haven't really been willing to just jump into the fray.
Yeah, they're very ambivalent, I think, and they've shown that ever since the uprising in Syria began in 2011. There was a lot of fairly aggressive rhetoric, I think, particularly by the political leadership about intervening, but I don't think it was, but those viewpoints were not shared by the military intelligence apparatus.
Thank you.
All right,
I'm Bert Wise, in recovering Washington water, but I was counsel to President Carter for oversight of the U.S. intelligence community. I'd like to go back to recent history, although I think it bears on today. We both were in the Obama administration, I believe, towards the end of his first term and the beginning of his second. And you've referenced in your article, Steve, a couple of times to the abandonment of Iraq as a source of ISIS. But there was a long period after that where most people agree that Maliki's refusal to diversify and to bring in Sunnis really helped very much lay the groundwork for ISIL. And we've read and heard that Biden and Obama and Kerry kept asking Maliki, telling him he should do that. But given all the money and the military assistance we were giving the government, I've seen almost no discussion of why we weren't able to exercise more leverage than simply asking him to do it. And the relevance today is with regard to the Saudis, who a lot of people along the political spectrum in Washington say we have to make them be out front so we're not leading. Have fallen back. Their initial airstrikes have faded away in Syria. They are still, as one article mentioned, helping some of the jihadists. So my question is, why has the U.S. not been able, with Maliki and now with the Saudis, who were giving F-35s, a ton of military assistance, exercise more leverage?
why hasn't the United States been able to exercise more leverage with Maliki and others?
You know, if you, as perhaps you've forgotten because it's been too long, but you know, when you're in government and you listen to the debate about this, it inevitably boils down to a kind of, you know, fruitless exchange that goes like this. If we don't threaten to withdraw our aid, they'll never listen to us. And the other side says, if we threaten to withdraw our aid, they'll never listen to us. You know, and that just you know, contributes to the inertia of policy, and it's certainly you know, a dynamic that, you know, recipients of assistance can count on to ensure a continued flow of goodies. So. To me, what you've just described fits a general pattern that goes back decades in American foreign policy and across all administrations. You know, Republican, Democrat, doesn't make a difference. Once you set a large program of assistance in motion, it becomes really impossible, because it's just too fraught, to remove it or withdraw it for whatever, you know, gains you think will result from that action. And since you can never have an agreement within government on whether those gains will actually obtain or whether you'll really undermine your position by withdrawing aid, you get paralysis. So it doesn't sort of surprise me that it happened in this instance. As far as getting the Saudis out front, it is administration policy, as you've indicated, that the Saudis be out front, so forth. But you know, the Saudis, you know, if you think back to what we were saying before about, you know, alliances and the current attenuation of U.S. alliances, is because, you know, objectives are just, you know, there's a divergence of objectives, and the Saudis have other fish to fry. As John was saying this earlier, the Saudis have other fish to fry in Syria, and moreover, right now they're already arguably overextended in Yemen. You know, they're conducting a fairly major military operation there with some assistance, you know, from the UAE, from the United Arab Emirates. But it's turned out to be pretty involving and pretty demanding. It's probably costing the Saudis about $6 billion a month to support that operation. So the idea that at the same time as they're operating so intensively at such a high tempo in Yemen, that they could also field an expeditionary force in Syria is, it just seems unlikely, I guess, to me at this point. There are other collateral considerations also, which is whether you would really want to insert a Saudi army into the supercharged sectarian environment of the Syrian battlefield.
Yes, my name is Alvin Rodriguez. I'm with the Roosh Political Action Committee. I wanted to raise two documents I'd like you to respond to that haven't been brought up yet out of direct bearing. One is to have the release of the 28 pages. Senator Bob Graham, co-chairman of that committee, where Bush classified 28 of those pages, and Obama has continued to have that. Well, Graham charges and other members of Congress that have read the report that there is a direct link between the Saudi monarchy and the attacks of 9/11, both in the financing, the organizing, and the logistical apparatus of it. That's one document I'd like to hear from you about why that should be released immediately.
I think that's a good document to talk about. Okay, but make it quick.
Recently released drone papers,
Yes.
which highlight and extend now this apparatus that Obama loves, the drone machines, which has resulted in deaths of thousands of innocent people, and really characterize Obama now as a war criminal and a man guilty of crimes against humanity that demands impeachment.
So let's start with the second one, because it's about now as opposed to really the other one's a 9/11 question, which maybe we can get to later. But let's start with the drone question, which is, and I think it's the question that needs to be raised underneath this, in addition to the document, is to what extent is the drone policy disruptive, influential? Where does it fit in the drone policy in terms of the Middle East conflict? What is its impact? What is the rhetoric from the point of inside the Middle East as opposed to here?
I mean, the drone, I mean, we know the fundamentals of the drone controversy. On the one hand, it makes us easier to intervene by involving fewer U.S. and allied casualties. It's because it arguably, from a strategic standpoint, at least helped us back out of Afghanistan when we wanted to, when it was a policy priority. And I think, I don't think the administration or anybody else is unaware or unappreciative of the ethical challenges that it poses. By the same token, drones have become increasingly accurate, and I think procedures by which they're used have been refined. That doesn't make them unproblematic, but perhaps less problematic. And again, they are perhaps less intrusive from the standpoint of breaching sovereignty than, say, massive manned airstrikes would be. In terms of, obviously they do produce a great deal of hostility and resentment on the part of the populations in which they're used. But again, I think, from the standpoint of a president that feels the need to use force from a counterterrorism point of view, the question he has to ask is whether just standing pat and doing nothing on the one hand, or using manned airstrikes on the other, that would probably involve just as much collateral damage, is a superior policy. And obviously, the president, with respect to the use of Afghanistan and Pakistan, has decided that's not the case.
I mean, one thing that is repeated constantly is the degree to which the drone strikes and the collateral damage from the drone strikes, both in the early years of the Obama administration and now, have led to a kind of resentment against the United States that's fodder for those who like ISIS.
Short term versus long term. It's also taken out large portions of Al Qaeda and prospectively ISIS infrastructure. and leadership. And that has, I mean, I think the view of the intelligence community is that that has had a direct impact, negative impact on their ability to wage their own terrorist strikes. So that's the short term. Longer term, yes, it increases the ability of those groups to recruit more people because they hate the United States for killing their relatives or their countrymen. And so, again, you get into a debate between the necessity of mowing the grass and the longer term compulsion to change the seeds.
More questions? Phil?
Obviously, we all know that Russia and the U.S. have conflicting objectives in Syria with regard to Assad. But given that we once saved France and Europe together about 70 years ago, and we have the same objective with regard to ISIS, is it diplomatically and militarily conceivable that the U.S. and Russia could somehow combine the efforts in the immediate short term with the problem of ISIS in Syria? Or is my question ridiculous? Feel free to say.
I think it isn't.
I don't hear anyone talking about that. I don't mean in this room. I mean out, in TV land or whatever. Why isn't anyone talking about that?
Why isn't anybody talking about sort of a non-aggression?
No, the opposite. Why can't? Is it conceivable, even though we have different goals in terms of Assad in Syria, that the U.S. and Russia could collaborate
Correct.
in terms of the
I
fight on
got it.
ISIS?
Right. Is it conceivable that the U.S. and Russia will collaborate in the anti-ISIS?
First, I can answer.
I don't think it's inconceivable at all. I don't know if that's where things will wind up, but, as a going-in position, I mean, the two sides have agreed to not get in each other's way, which is kind of a form of passive cooperation, I guess, or tacit cooperation. If the ceasefire that Secretary Kerry was talking about the other day takes place, it will be because of a bargain that's been struck behind the scenes, where the groups supported by the U.S. Cease their attacks on regime forces, and Russians cease their air attacks on the groups backed by the United States. I don't know if that arrangement would be framed publicly in exactly that sort of transactional quid pro quo way, but surely that will have to have been the basis of a ceasefire if Secretary Kerry is right and they actually pull it off. The U.S. and Russia have a shared objective in pounding ISIS, so I guess that'll lead to some sort of implicit or informal alignment of operations.
Yeah, I don't, not a ridiculous question at all. I mean, I think, as Steve was saying, if you get a ceasefire in place, sort of an overarching one that's complemented particularly by smaller local ceasefires, and then, getting farther into the realm of being probable, you get a sustainable political process that involves some sort of negotiation among Syrian parties. Then the possibility of some kind of U.S.-Russian ground-level collaboration becomes all the more possible.
We have time for really not one more question, but we're going to take one more, make it 30 words, and a 30-word answer. Yeah, go ahead.
Two countries that, or areas that haven't been the focus of as much attention, obviously, is the wake of Friday as well, which is Libya and Yemen, and Libya, maybe North Africa, I guess, as a whole. And while maybe not as strategically important as Syria, how do you view them going forward in terms of their ability to destabilize?
The question is, what is the role of Libya and Yemen going forward in terms of further destabilizing the region and the conflict?
Yeah, in 25 words or less, Yemen Yemen was not in great shape, before what's happened. But it's been, it actually reminds me of, the title of one of John's books, We wrecked the place.
That's about the other.
You know, that'll be the
IRA.
book about the Saudi intervention. You know, we wrecked the place. Now, in Yemen, how do you tell the difference? It's a little bit problematic, but the fact is it was better, you know, it was better before. Okay, so how all that gets put back together again, actually, I have no idea. Libya, you know, it was problematic because the countries that backed the intervention and the toppling of the Gaddafi regime, although they had done extensive planning to reconstruct and stabilize the country, no one really stepped up to the plate. And already in the Transattack period, that is to say, when the NATO was operating militarily. Sorry? We gotta go.
Very well said. Very